Hello, I'm Denton Davidson, Senior Editor at Gold Derby, and I'm here to moderate this Gold Derby panel with the filmmakers behind 20th Century Studios and Locksmith Animation's Ron's Gone Wrong. With me now are director and writer Sarah Smith, producer Julie Lockhart, and writer Pete Baynham. I just want to start off by congratulating you all on this film being the only British animated film eligible this year, and you're also among just 7 eligible for BAFTA at this time. So, Julie, just from a producer's perspective, can you express how exciting this is for Locksmith Animation's first film and what sort of challenges you went through to get here?
Well, I mean, setting up a studio, working for the first time with our digital partners. Neither of us had done a movie before. Throwing in a bit of Brexit, throwing in a huge pandemic. It wasn't the easiest, but it's quite incredible. We are so proud of what came out of it and how London has just embraced, and the UK has just embraced this whole idea of building a studio and creating an industry here. It's been a wonderful ride.
And the movie is about an awkward middle schooler named Barney and his new walking, talking, digitally connected device, Ron. He's called a B-Bot. And Ron has some pretty epic malfunctions that launch him and Barney on a journey that teaches them and all of us really about true friendship. And Pete, you've been nominated for a couple Oscars as the writer of Borat films in the past. So some people might be surprised that you wrote this animated film along with Sarah. And I've heard you think Borat and Ron are actually quite similar characters. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, Ron's not really anti-Semitic, thankfully. That wouldn't wash in a Disney animated movie.
Yes.
And he doesn't tend to wear mankinis and say awful things. But no, it's just that they're both idiots. They're both clown characters. And Sasha, when he originally started out, before he became, who he is, he studied clowning. And so he always talks, when we're in writing meetings about clowning and this whole theory of this fancy French teacher he went to of any more stupid and you die. And I think that both Ron and Borat have that. I think what it is that they both got very little downloaded onto them at the beginning. And what that is useful for, apart from the comedy of the knockabout comedy and not being able to get up or walk down the stairs or up the stairs, is also their greater illuminating things about life. So they ask questions. So they're like a little child. They ask why. And it's an incredibly fun, useful way to then start. Obviously, in the case of Borat, you're exposing things like anti-Semitism and racism and whatever, and using that as a device. And in Ron, Ron we used to try and get that Trojan horse of a bit of satire about the social media time we're living in, so that he's this simple character, but then he's going through it with Barney, and then we get to explore a little bit of what we're going through in this crazy time.
And Sarah, you co-wrote this with Pete, and you took on directing the film as well. What is it about Ron's Gone Wrong that has struck a chord with family audiences and made it so relatable to so many people?
I think it's relatable because it's us and our families and our kids and our issues in the film. It's actually a school movie, and animation hasn't really done school movies for very good reasons. I mean, technically it's crazy difficult. You have giant crowds. I also, wanted every kid in the crowd to have their own B-bot and to move like kids, and, it had to pass muster with kids watching it that they felt like relatable, contemporary kind of middle schoolers. So that's a big technical challenge. But when, for us as parents and with families, school is the biggest thing that hits your kid. It absolutely overwhelms them. It's their massive life experience, and it throws them into this kind of popularity contest where you go to school and twice a day they have to go out in the yard and say who wants to play with me, and it becomes their absolute overwhelming life experience of how do I survive in the social world. And on top of that, they then have devices and online groups and chat groups and so on. And so really in the movie, it's full of the conversations that I was having with my daughter when I put her to bed at night and sitting on the end of her bed, and Pete with his daughters and so on, and JP, my other director, etc. All of us, it was the things we were talking to our kids about how it is to be in that kind of social world. And I think, just going back to what you were saying about starting a British studio, I think when Julie and I set up Locksmith, for me, one of the reasons for making films in the UK is that you're not borrowing your ideas from the rest of the industry. you're not making movies derived from other animated movies. You know, you're very much in a separate space away from that industry, and it encourages you to look to your life and the biggest concerns of you and your kids and the audience.
And I think we all can relate to being awkward in middle school, which this film really highlights, and you're just trying to get by without being noticed for a couple of days. But here we see Barney ending up with sort of this broken, low quality version of the latest cool toy everyone else has. And I want to talk not just about the character of Ron, but the entire futuristic landscape this film takes place in. Julie, can you talk about the animation team behind this and how they worked to achieve these incredible visuals we see in the film and the world of none such?
I think the world itself was very much, the design side of it was very much based around, you know, where does it feel most at home? And, you know, where location-wise, I know Sarah and JP and Pete spent a lot of time trying to work it out with the designers where it feels right. I think originally, Sarah, you thought it might be in London, didn't you? And then you chose to reposition it in Northern California, mainly because of the access to the beautiful outdoors there, and also the fact that you're in that tech world as well. As far as the animation is concerned, we started with our digital partners, DNEG, who were starting their first movie in London. Obviously, they're world-renowned visual effects artists, but they hadn't done an animation pipeline. Yet they were bringing people in, and we, as well as Locksmith, we were bringing people in from all over, globally, coming into London to make this movie. So we had a lot of influences across the board and a lot of experience. So, you know, as far as interpreting these designs and making them work, we had people who knew exactly what they were doing and had spent time in the studios alongside people who were doing it for the first time. And so we were very lucky in that respect, in that we used a community that had, you know, very mixed levels, but could help each other on that.
I think it comes down to, as well, is an eclectic group of talent who are brilliant at what they do, but all came from different spaces. So Aurelian Pradal, the production designer, is absolutely fabulous with color and light, but came from, you know, much more kind of very, very unreal animation, if you know what I mean, very stylized is the word I'm looking for, kind of animation worlds that he's worked before. Nathan Crowley was the designer on The Dark Knight and on every Christopher Nolan movie, you know, and comes from that big picture future vision. And then there was Till Novak, a German designer who worked with me on Arthur, who is the person I would literally hire to design an actual Bebot if I was Apple. You know, he's just a brilliant kind of contemporary tech designer. And I think it's the mixture of those sort of talents all brought to bear on the film that gives it its flavor.
I think as well, what was really exciting with the world, when you talk about the futuristic world, was for us to really, and this is what I think the design team did so amazingly, was to actually ground it in what feels like now. Like we had watched, you know, when we started talking about this movie, we'd watched other movies that are on similar themes about, you know, somebody gets a robot or a robot becomes available commercially. And quite often they would be set in a kind of world that wasn't quite ours. And I've always personally loved stories that really, both adults and kids can see their own world, see their surroundings in that story. And then to take that world that's not drab, but is kind of, I think they did an amazing job of making a regular, almost like an ET type world, but make it somehow beautiful. But then to have the Bebots come in and then light that world up, which is what I think would happen. You know, anything set in the future never takes account of the fact that the future actually looks like now. It's just what comes into it and then what invades that world.
I should give credit to JP, who's the other director, who's not with us today, but you know, JP also has, he worked at Aardman and at Pixar and brings a particular kind of charm, which then pulled together all those different art influences, I think. So there's a lot of influences in there. But as Julie said, originally, I imagined it around my kids' school, because when you're thinking up a story and you're pulling it from your life, you know, you imagine your own world. But I think the world we set it in, for me, is one of those film landscapes of the imagination. You know, it's where the Goonies is set, it's E.T., it's kind of part of collective consciousness. And we always were super keen that we would make movies out of the UK, but for the world. And so there's a kind of universality in those landscapes, I think, as they're the background to so many classic films.
And the racial diversity and the way characters are dressed really speaks to sort of telling those worldwide stories where you are relating to people from all walks of life. Was that sort of the goal in the character development as well?
Yeah, of course, definitely. I mean, you know, that is the world that we live in. And in particular, the world of Bubble, which is basically Apple meets Google meets Facebook, you know, that I said, look, this is peopled by the top graduate from every tech school in the world. So like, off you go, let's have every nationality represented here, you know, because that's literally who would be at that company. So it was a great way to build a big, diverse world.
And Pete, you've written some risque things in the past. So you definitely have a sense of humor that caters to both children and adults in this film. And the whole family really can watch this together, and it's hilarious for everyone. But Mike, I was wondering, how do you sort of walk that tightrope of writing a film that's, you know, the core audience is going to be kids, but also getting that stuff in there for adults to feel like they can relate to the story as well, because it really blends perfectly in this movie.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's always like, for one thing, you know, so many ideas you come up with are, we can't do that. That's a bit, so you're not seeking to either write family material or adult material. You're just writing whatever is coming out and you're going, can we do this? But I think what I think the ambition, what I love to see and what I love to write with Sarah is things that are, not that it's passed out, there's jokes for the parents and then there's jokes for the kids. The absolute sweet spot is if you get jokes that are edgy, but everyone laughs at them. So when I sit down and watch a movie with my 8-year-old, I'm laughing at the same things. And I'm not always crazy about if you go, oh, that joke was just for the mums and dads. You know, you can do that and there are subtle things, but you can't overdo that. And I just love where there's an edge to it. And I think Britishness, I don't know, there's just an automatic naughtiness or a mischievousness that we just always find ourselves. So we write lines and you think, surely we're going to get an email from Disney. You know, when there's a line about like Barney's grandmother talking about, I once mended my own hernia with a bread knife and vodka. And you think, and you put it in and you go, well, it can live and we can remember this time when it was in the script and we can laugh about it. And remember when we had that line in the script? And then it gets through and you go, yes. But I think it's also about not being too dark and not being too, you want it to be, you know, we're big softies as well. You know, we want big hearts.
Pete and I met making dark adult comedy before we went into animation. Both of us did live action British television comedy. And I don't think we think about, oh, we must make this edgy or we're right for the children, right for the adults. I mean, it's just kind of, it's us as people wanting to make the kind of film that we want to watch with our kids. You know, we're trying to make the movies that we want to exist, that we can take our kids to the cinema and see, you know. So you're wearing your parent hat when you're writing it and thinking about sitting on your sofa with your kids watching something. And that's how you hold the line, I think. You know, that's how you know what you want. And kids are sophisticated and they like slightly naughty, edgy things, don't they? So, you know, The Simpsons gets away with absolutely murder.
And think that's very tough.
Oh, go ahead.
I just think kids are also fantastically tough on story and on not wasting everyone's time. And it's the most terrifying screening is when you screen your movie. For kids, because they will tell you, and they won't even need to tell you. You can just tell by looking at their faces. You go, all right, we need to cut some out of this bit. This scene doesn't work. This goes nowhere. They're a great test.
When 6 of them go to the toilet, you know you've got a problem in that scene.
I was just going to mention what actually the unique blend that Pete and Sarah bring. Our movie is of a excellent quality level, and it stands alongside the giants in the LA studios. But what it brings is this unique blend of comedy that I don't think can be seen, and that's down to Pete and Sarah's history and writing styles, and it just feels very unique in its place, purely down to the specifically the writing and that edge, that element of edge that just gets you there.
I would also say, by the way, that this, as much as like this, the other work I do in forming this this informs that as well. So I'm always driving people nuts in a writer's room with Sacha Baron Cohen when I'm going on about Pixar and I'm going on about and the structure of Toy Story, and they go, oh, don't start on about Toy Story again, because so many of those films are just classic, great storytelling that everyone can learn something from. You could go and write any movie after watching one of those, and you've learned great lessons.
And you don't have to have children to like animated films. You know, there are films and they bring us back to a time that we had fun and enjoyed. There's also a spotlight on how technology and social media can really harm young people. And one of the subjects that is covered with both humor and sensitivity is Poop Girl. And I don't want to spoil this context of why she's labeled that for anyone who hasn't seen it. But Sarah, I felt so terrible for her. And when I was looking at it, I was thinking these things are happening to kids today, where they're publicly humiliated and labeled on social media. Can you talk about why you wanted to address subjects like the internet and bullying and isolation and bring it out in this character in particular?
I mean, that, you know, in the end, that is entirely the inspiration for the movie. It is a classic friendship story, but really, you know, it came from me thinking I wanted to find a way to put an iPad into a movie and explore the kid's relationship with the iPad. And the Bebop is basically a walking, talking animated character made out of an iPad, really. And, you know, it was when I saw the movie Her, the Spike Jonze film, I felt like we have to make that movie for kids because they're even more immersed in that world and don't understand that perhaps people are talking to them, or you know, there's manipulation or things aren't exactly as they seem. And I felt it was so important that we're not talking to children about that in films and books and TV, that, you know, talking to them about that experience. And I think the difficulty in the film is it's such a rich area. There are so many things to be said. You know, I had the walls around me here in this room with like post-it notes and people working together of all the stories that you could touch on of how it's affecting people. But that thing about public shaming and being labelled was one that we really wanted to hang on to. And we researched all the, you know, there's that John Ronson's brilliant book, He's Been Publicly Shamed, you know, that tells you the stories of people that this has happened to. And we tried to find a kind of a light and comic kids way that could exist in this movie. You could make a movie about that on its own. And I'd say that's the hard thing, is trying to kind of weave it in. And so in the end, I don't think the movie comes out with a, you know, clear judgment, don't do this, do that. We're trying to portray it and provoke the conversation really between parents and kids and let them kind of feel for themselves the potential consequences of what's happening online.
Can I say, by the way, that that's true, that we did have versions earlier on where it was a little bit more like, go and, you know, put down the device, go and run around the woods with a stick. And then you realize, no, that's not happening. I think in the end, we end up kind of exploring the world with kids, and it's all the concerns that adults have been having for a while. So if you've seen movies like The Social Dilemma or whatever, and we watched all those things and read on all that and about the algorithms and how, you know, these, and, you know, we're finding out now that like that some of these giant social media companies have been doing their own research into the effects of their platforms on kids, specifically on kids, and then they haven't done anything about it because obviously they've got gigantic profit margin and they've got advertising, and so it's happening in kids. So I can't imagine having to live through this, you know, as a 13, 14-year-old. And you think, stand back, those 13, 14-year-olds and younger kids are being targeted. They're actually being targeted by algorithms, and they're being manipulated and moved. And look at this, look at this, look at this. And it's just a crazy time. So we just wanted to explore that, obviously in an entertaining way, because you can't satirize or lecture without making them laugh.
We had a very good note early on from an executive who said to us, don't let them smell the medicine. If kids smell medicine, they are not going to be on your side.
Yeah,
and I think ultimately, just because of the nature of storytelling and how much material, you know, you can put in a movie, the movie kind of simplified itself down to not so much, you know, lining up all of those things and shooting them down, but putting forward the alternative, which is a real messy contrarian friendship between two characters that are wildly different and don't share interests and end up, you know, start off by fighting and find like the richest, most fun friendship of all.
It's almost like there's an irony in the fact that the most human, messy relationship in the movie is with a boy and a device with 4% of its download. But that's what, like, he has to teach Ron about friendship, but then he ends up learning about how complicated and amazing it is himself.
And the cast is fantastic. The voiceover actors. Jack Dylan Grazer is the lead Barney. You have Zach Galifianakis, who's so funny as Ron. Ed Helms plays Barney's dad. And then, of course, Olivia Colman as Donka, Barney's immigrant grandmother, who I didn't even realize was in the movie until the end credits. So, Pete, I was curious, when you're writing lines, are you like secretly worried in your head? Like, I hope they cast people who can actually be funny. And what went through your mind when you actually saw your characters come to life with these actors in this film?
It's mind-blowing. And you have conversations about who might play this character. And you might early on say, and somebody might say Olivia Colman, and you think, and I'm still like, yeah, good luck with that. Because like, or Sarah, when Sarah said we might get Zach Galifianakis to play Ron, and I almost feel embarrassed and very British about like, yeah, but they won't want to do our film. Go on. And so when they actually say yes, and then they come into the studio and then they're lovely and they're relatable and they're just there to, and they're excited as well. It's obviously mind blowing. I mean, with somebody like Donka, Donka was based on my grandmother who used to give myself and my brother raw pork sausages. And she wasn't Bulgarian. And she was that kind of very un-PC, lovable granny who says all the outrageous things that your parents don't approve of. But then to have Olivia Colman do that in the end, it's just, yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing.
When we're writing, we kind of do voices to, obviously Pete and I have voices for them all because we're doing it to each other, and I'll do one and he'll do the other. And so we have idea, we've written it with an idea in our heads of what they're like. And then when, Olivia in particular, so when we were doing the animatic, I did all the scratch for Donka, and I did her much fiercer because we'd imagined her very sort of stuff and nonsense, chop your finger off, oh, don't be silly, little scratch, And then when Olivia came in, she did it with such kind of gorgeous warmth, and it totally lifted it into another place. And that's an amazing moment. My favorite moment is when there's a slightly dodgy line that you haven't written terribly well, and some actor makes it sound so effortlessly real, and you're like, thank you, you just saved us.
I was going to ask if there was much improvisation, and I also was curious how much the actors are able to interact together. Are they all alone in a booth by themselves throughout this whole process, or how is that like working with the voiceover acting?
Yeah, I love it when they're together. When I did Arthur Christmas, I had all the cast together all the time, and I had or at least pairings of them, but this time for different reasons, including COVID, they were very much on their own, apart from a glorious scene which you would know if you watch the film. You'll be able to point at it when Jack and when Barney and Ron are arguing, and we actually had Zach and Jack for that, and it just lifted off, and there is lots of improvisation in there that makes it really special. And we had a couple between the characters who are the head of Bubble, so Rob Dylan Grazer and Justice Smith, Rob Delaney and Justice Smith. We had them together a couple of times, so that was fun. But by and large, they were doing it not only individually, but sometimes in their homes with, blankets rigged up, having to throw their family off the internet because we were in lockdown and they were having to record like that. So
didn't Olivia have a tractor go past her house?
She did. We had to
and
stop
a hedge trimmer.
But they are great improvisers. Jack is an extraordinary young actor. He will give you the same line 11 different ways. Zach obviously is kind of comedy gold and would kind of run with things. But Ed Helms as well, in particular, he's brilliant at improvising, and he would improvise entire speeches and scenes around things that we gave him. The only difficulty with Ed is the edit, because you come back with so much material to work with. So even though they're on their own, they managed to find that groove. And as for Olivia, we had her jumping up and down, puffing, doing dancing on a table while singing in Bulgarian. So they're very game, bless them.
And Julie, as sort of a bigger picture, Locksmith Animation is based in London, but you're creating content for a global audience that sort of is there to show that, not everything is just in Hollywood. Can you talk about how important it is for the animation industry, specifically of this kind, to continue to grow worldwide and outside of what we know?
There are so many stories out there that aren't centered in the States, and you know, I don't want it to sound, it's a bit like not trying to cross the line with Ron and giving the kids, because they'll smell the medicine. It's the same thing. You can use animation to educate, and you can use animation in from different parts of the world, different stories around the world, and that will educate people in their living rooms. And that, you know, that's hugely important to be able to do that. And so that's not only in different cultures, but also in how people emotionally react to things, and, you know, and what's shared across the world. So there's an animation seems to be a wonderful way to tell that story. And I mean, I think you'll see from some of the sort of long-listed BAFTA choices. I mean, you've got some incredible stories that are not your typical Hollywood studio movie, but it says incredibly important things in almost a documentary style, and it uses an animation to disguise any recognition, rather than it being a live action documentary. So there are so many ways that one can use animation for to get messages across, that I think it doesn't have to be a specific style based on what has been hugely commercially successful, but it does need authenticity, and it needs quality, and it needs to have a really good story to tell. So that's where we come from, really.
And on a similar note, Sarah, you're sort of blazing this trail as a female animation director in a heavily male-dominated field. This is your second film you directed after the wildly successful Arthur's Christmas, which we briefly mentioned earlier. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are on women working in animation today. Are we making progress? Are there things you would like to see happen to get women more involved in animation or directing, or both?
We are making progress, and yet if you look at the BAFTA list, I'm the only female director on that list at the moment. So you feel like you are, and then when you actually stop and do the count, you still realize that there are very few women at the helm. I think it is a really complex issue. It's both tradition and history in terms of who was going into animation, and there are definitely a lot of very talented women coming through the ranks at the moment, who in the area of like heads of story or animators. So I do think it will change a lot. I also think there are outlets for different styles and different types of stories, with things like Netflix and so on, and coming on stream, that there's so much variety now that is also kind of opens doors. It is more complex though, because it's not even just about animation, it's about women in leadership roles, and about how that sits. And it's a really, really tricky thing. I think that I have very similar qualities to, men that do this job. I'm super passionate, I have a real sort of, I'm very exacting about where you want to go, and you have a really passionate kind of vision for something. But a lot of those qualities are deemed very differently in women than in men. And that is a difficult thing to live with, I think. And I also think, my daughter said it to me as I was driving here on my way this evening, and she just said, women worry about it more, Mum. Women worry about this stuff. And I think that's absolutely true. You go into, really making an animated movie is, especially because we started the company and it was like my idea of the story, and it's a giant sticking of your head above a parapet. It really is. And more people take pot shots at women, I think, that do that. I think it's just an instinctive thing. And I also think that we angst about it more. And so that is what is off-putting about the job, I think, is just that it's the toughing out the emotional aspects of being in that leadership role that makes it hard. And I think women often choose not to do that, not to put themselves through that. So it is changing though, as I say, because there are so many brilliant, talented women coming through, younger women, and because there are so many outlets for individual stories, I think we will see change, but it's been slow coming in live action as well, right? It's still we're nowhere near 50-50, and it is hard to put your finger on it, other than the kind of personality type involved and how women feel about adopting those personality traits.
So what turned for you? Because you mentioned that you had been in comedy, live action TV. So how did you end up like, yes, I'm going to direct this animated film? How did that happen? Mental.
I was directing a comedy drama in an ice rink in the north of England, and it was falling down. And I remember my production designer said to me, have you seen Lost in La Mancha? It was like that, right? You know, there was like, and I got a call. It was a total nightmare situation. And I got a call from Aardman, and I'd been in touch with them a few years later, and they'd kept a note of me, and they were looking for someone to come and head up feature development for them and put together a new slate. And I took the call in a changing room that smelt of the urine of male ice hockey players. And I remember thinking, animation sounds warm. I wouldn't have to be out here in this stinking ice rink with rats with Weil's disease and so on. And so I agreed to go to Aardman just for 6 months to help them develop some projects. And I completely fell in love with their world. And, you know, for somebody, I love movies. I've always loved movies. And in the UK world, it was a kind of fast track access to movies. We had, after, you know, a year at Aardman, I put together a new slate, and we had the chairman of Sony and the chairman of Universal, whatever, flew in, you know, and sat in their kind of boardroom in a business park on the edge of Bristol to hear Aardman's pitches. And so it was such a ride and a roller coaster. But after I'd been there, and then I took over running the feature department, it was where I met Julie. One of the films I developed, she then produced, with Pete Lord directing. But, you know, I wanted to go back to being a filmmaker. And so I called Pete and went, guess where I am? I'm at Aardman. And he said, oh, I've got an idea that might work for animation, which was Arthur Christmas. And we started writing it. And I said to them, I want to go back to being a filmmaker and I want to direct it. And stupidly, everyone forgot to say no. So I found myself, you know, coming from this live action world, you know, suddenly making an animated film. And I fell in love with the people. I fell in love with the art form. And, you know, the only thing at that point was that I had to go to America to make it, because there wasn't really a studio solution. So we went out and used Sony ImageWorks for production. And coming back from that, I wanted to recreate the experience we'd had at the beginning of Arthur, where we brought in a team to the UK. And it was a really special creative time for that team. And I felt like I wanted to come back to England and recreate that environment, which is when I called up Julie and sat in a bar and persuaded her that we should start a studio. And what's amazing, as Julie said, is there are now multiple animated features being made in London. It's, you know, the visual effects industry started like that. It really grew with the Harry Potter films, and suddenly we are like the world leader in visual effects. And animation is really on a roll in London right now, which is super exciting.
And you've all been part of such critically acclaimed, Oscar-nominated, BAFTA-nominated projects. So I'm curious about Pete and Julie as well. Pete, how do you go from being like, oh yeah, I like writing, to becoming a script writer, which is a totally different animal, and writing Borat and all of these incredible films?
Well, I want to go back to my mid-20s self and tell him how to do it, and don't take all the crazy wrong turns that I did take. But no, well, I mean, I started out like I have a very weird, you know, history in that I was in the Merchant Navy when I was 16, and so I the well-trodden path of like Merchant Navy screenwriter. I don't recommend that one personally. But no, I just washed up in London and then started doing things like trying to get into theatre, and then trying to be a failed stand-up for a while, and all kinds of disastrous wrong turns. And then I ended up in radio, just writing sketches, submitting satirical sketches to a now defunct weekly satirical radio sketch show. And Sarah showed up there, and kind of the rest is history. And then we did a bunch of radio shows together, and and that was the edgier, more satirical side of what we do. And then and in the UK at the time, there was this path from radio to TV, and we kind of went through that adventure together. And so that was all like, and I mean, I partnered up with Sarah then, and Sarah's like such a kind of like just amazing force of nature who would just go in and like tell people to say, make this show. I'm more like, oh, you don't want my show? Okay, fine. And Sarah said, no, let us make this show. And so we just got so many amazing opportunities early on. And so that, you know, there's a much longer, much more boring story to it. But yeah, and then somehow ended up here in LA working on Borat, which is when Sarah called up, and you know, that's
before that. Pete called me. He said he'd been called by Sasha, and Sasha said, "Will you come out and work on this film that I'm doing?" Didn't know Sasha, And he said, look, I don't, I've got so much going on in the UK. I don't want to go and be stuck out there and get drawn in. So look, I'm going for 12 weeks. But at the end of it, if I don't come back, you've got to get on a plane and come and get me and force me to come back. That's what you made me agree to do that.
Yeah.
And then there you go. It didn't work out like that. He met his wife and moved over there. And ever since then, we've had to work on Zoom.
Yeah.
And Julie, how about you? How did you end up producing films and building film production companies?
Well, I mean, the film production company was something Sarah and I downloaded from the internet, wasn't it, Sarah? That was always the one thing. Like, how the hell did you do that? That's the side of it. Neither of us, we were guessing a lot of that. The actual production side. I mean, I come from animation. Having done different types of animation and worked through it that way with short films, commercial series, that side of things, and then features. So, anyone I talk to is like, I got into, I arrived at Aardman when they were very small, and anyone I speak to now, any young people that are wanting to get into the industry, I like, go to a small company, because you get to do everything, and you get to grow with the company. If it's something that you want to do and you really feel something towards, then you will grow and you will step into those places and you will be able to, you learn a hell of a lot, because you learn across the board. And that's kind of what happened when I was at Aardman. In fact, they all ran off to do Chicken Run at one point back in the 90s and left me in charge of commercials. We had an absolute ball, and it just sort of went on from there, really. So it's stop frame is a wonderful art form. It is so full of craft, and but it's a very similar start. To make the movie, you're very similar in the way that you do it. You cast, you do black and white storyboards to the voice. You put the film together. I mean, you make the film in the same way before you hand it over to production. So you get a blueprint in storyboard and with cast and voice and music and ideas, and then you just produce it in a different way as a CG film versus a stop frame film. But if that stop frame is more akin to live action, but just very slow, as opposed to CG, which is kind of a bit like pulling teeth when you've done stop frame. CG is a crazy, crazy world, because it's so many different elements and you don't see it till the end. And then the end, but you do have a lot, you have a lot more flexibility when you make a film in CG. You're not constrained by what you can see in front of you. So they're all wonderful mediums to work in.
It's very invidious as well that we're talking about ourselves here as the filmmakers, because you know that animation is the biggest team and the most collaborative over 3 years. And missing here today is JP, who directed with me, and also Octavio Rodriguez, who's our co-director, who came from Story at Pixar and brought a lot of that experience. Obviously designers, Aurelian and Nathan Crowley, and our animation team, and Philippe Denis, who was our VFX supervisor, who we stole from, DreamWorks. And we were very ambitious with Locksmith. I stalked people. I went out to LA. And honestly, here's the secret, is when you heard that people were a bit discontented at a studio, I would take up residence in a local Starbucks and then invite people for coffee. And that way I basically stalked them, especially people who had so many Europeans in animation, right? Fill the US studios with European talent. And so the ones particularly who had like elderly relatives, you're listening out and saying, come back over here. And so we assembled an incredible team for the movie, and it wouldn't be what it is without them.
Such a big, it's such a giant commitment that people make in an animated movie, in terms of uprooting their lives, their families, their children, all the practicalities of having to, relocate your entire existence. And I think that I don't think animation people get enough credit for that. It's not just the slow, laborious, brilliant work that they do. It's the fact that they will just commit to something for like 3, 4. Moving every few years is that's kind of tough on a family.
Although the joy we found is that people have moved here and they've stayed. So, there's a lot going on in London at the moment. So that's kind of exciting. It's an exciting place to be, really. So we're very lucky there.
Well, congratulations once again on doing such incredible work. Thank you so much for joining me today to discuss Ron's Gone Wrong. Viewers, if you have not seen this movie, it's available to stream on HBO Max and Disney Plus in the States. And Julie, Pete, Sarah, best of luck to this award season, and congratulations on your great work on this film.
Thanks
you.
so much.
Thank you
Nice
so
to see you.
Thanks.